Go.
Today is Thursday, February 25th, 2016. We are at the museum, and today I'm interviewing Dave Pankonin, a lifelong Louisville resident, and Del Hervey, another board member, is also here to perhaps ask Dave or give some information and get some farming information going. So Dave, why don't you just begin, if you would, tell us about your parents, when they came to Louisville, and just the basics of your family's residence in Louisville.
Well, I think I'm going to go back to
Sure.
several generations. My great-grandfather, Herman E. Pankonin, was a German immigrant from a place that's, at the time was Prussia, that is now part of Poland. The town was Posen, and we've had relatives go back to the Lutheran church there and find some original records, which was pretty rare because after World War II, the Russians came through that area. But he immigrated in the early 1880s, and there's Pankonins in Michigan, and then some of them moved to Nebraska. The Pankonin name, by the way, is a Finnish background name, but those folks must have come across from across the Baltic Sea to farm the North German plain. And I've been to Finland. A lot of rocky soil, wouldn't be very good farming there, so they moved to the northern German plain, north and east of Berlin, and then eventually immigrated. Herman was part of, I think there were 12 siblings, and many of them got to Cass County, to the Louisville area. But it was interesting that all the rest of them, except for Herman, went out to Perkins County, and the wheat ground was cheaper. Went out there. Some subsequent generations come back to visit and said, why'd they ever leave Cass County? Because of the beauty of the ground and just more rainfall and a more successful climate for agriculture, corn and soybean production. But regarding that, Herman then established a business in 1883 in Louisville that was kind of at the time hardware, plumbing, and farm implements. And he signed on with McCormick Gearing organization. So that business, that McCormick company, ended up as part of International Harvester in 1903. So long background, and as a dealership in the United States of continuing locations. I think that's the second oldest location in the United States. The other one is out at Central City, Nebraska, by the way. The Grosshands family have been at it for a long time, a couple years older. So that's one of the little caveats there. Herman was a member of the Emmanuel Lutheran Church. He married Mary Gable, who lived right on the corner down from the church. And my great-grandmother, so the stories went in the family that she traded with Indians, our Native Americans, and the way back in her history, because she was on the outskirts south of Louisville. So to that union were two sons, born Charles and William, and Herman had quite a farming operation of his own. William took over the farm part, and in 1910 my grandfather, Charles Pankonin, purchased the implement part of the business enterprise. I've got the original papers. $2,500 was the price of the business. He and my great-grandfather Herman had two stores that were next to each other on Main Street, and you'd walk in the front door, and I don't remember, this before my time. You went one way to the implement shop, you went the other way to the plumbing hardware operation, and so they were side by side in business and kind of obviously somewhat similar. In 1915, among many other merchants and farmers in the area, they were part of the founding group of Home State Bank in Louisville in 1915, and so there was a toehold, a stakehold, about 20% interest in the bank when it formed, and that kind of weave into the story later on. So Charles Pankonin was in business from 1910 until his death in 1960 for 50 years in the implement business, representing International Harvester after they formed. He was also president of Home State Bank. He wasn't the day-to-day active person, but was the president of the bank from the 1930s on. And so taking those two businesses through the Great Depression and raising three children was not an easy task, but made it all go. And he had 3 children, Eldora Pankonin, an aunt, and then Lester Pankonin, and then my father, Charles Elwood Pankonin. So as you get towards the World War II era in the 30s, Eldora graduated from Louisville High School, went to Nebraska Wesleyan for a year, but the money ran out, came home, and she worked at the bank then for many, many years. My uncle Les graduated in 1935, went to the University of Nebraska, and he was a very successful student and a track athlete, a very successful track athlete, and he and my dad also spent a year working at Ashgrove Cement Company. He took off from the university to work there to just get the funds to keep going. My dad graduated in 1937 from Louisville High School at the depth of the Depression. He told the story about his parents giving him $10. He hitchhiked to Lincoln to start at the university. He was also a track athlete, like his older brother Les, not quite as successful, but enough to letter. I've got his 1938 letter sweater encased in a glass case in my office. And they didn't have scholarships, but the athletic department helped them get jobs. And so the story was my dad had 4 jobs, out for track, going to school. Just admire, some people have called that the greatest generation, but it's, I don't know if that's the right word, but it was an admirable a generation who wanted education bad enough to work that hard at it. And in December of '41, when Pearl Harbor came around, he would have graduated in the spring 1942, but in patriotic fervor, he joined the armed services, the United States Army, and never did quite finish his undergrad. But he ended up serving in Europe and the Italian campaign for a couple years overseas, came back in 1946 to go into business with his father, and it was then C.J. Pankonin and Son. I've got the original agreement of the business had gone up from $2,500 to $8,900. They divided it in 2. A little sidebar story is my dad had saved his money during the service, and when he came back, my grandfather said to him, well, you don't have any money to get in business. He said, I got $10,000, what do you have? So with that money, they redid the store. Was then a long time the Napa store in Louisville, but it was on Main Street. Redid the whole business for a more modern at that time look. And my dad was a very aggressive salesperson at the time. It would have been trading horses for the tractors, particularly coming after World War II, when a lot of farm equipment was not made because the factories were making armaments. So it was a big mechanization move, and they talked about him having a bunch of horses behind my grandfather's home on the top of North Hill in Louisville as he was trading horses for tractors post-World War II. But he was a great business person. He worked with his dad until his dad's death in 1960. Eldora worked at the bank. Lester Pankonin, my uncle, had a very successful career with General Electric Company, ended up being a vice president in charge of the Louisville, Kentucky appliance park operation, and very successful career, retired in Naples, Florida. But in 1975, things changed for our family, and my mother, who'd come to Louisville as a school teacher, her name was Suzanne Pope. She was from Sutton, Nebraska, Clay County, and she had gone to university. There was a little age difference after kind of post-World War II, came to Louisville to teach. That's when she met my father. I was born in December of 1951 with a sister, Roxanne, and a brother, Philip, that were born in the mid-50s. And so they had 3 children. My dad was working at the store. My mom was a homemaker and did a lot of substitute teaching, but also was always interested in education, was always taking graduate courses and just college courses that she was interested in throughout her life. So education was really important to her. Also had an example at home besides the business and the church and the home, was that both my parents were interested in public service and elected public service. My dad had been on the village board chair when Louisville was paved and many improvements were made. My mother was on the school board and the first woman president of the Louisville School Board. And actually there had been, after subsequently I was elected, there was 4 generations of the family that served on the school board. So we had that, in the background. But in March 1975, I graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1974. I was going to Northwestern University's MBA program in Evanston, Illinois. I was back on my last break before graduating, and my father passed away very suddenly at age 56. So really was a different trajectory from there on. I didn't return to finish my master's. My mother was 51 years old, had a sister in college, a brother in high school, and there's no question of maybe staying temporarily. I was engaged to be married, but things really just made a big change. And so we had to make a lot of decisions within a couple years, and subsequently got married to Lori Chase from Laurel, Nebraska. I'll tell you more about her in a little bit. But then we decided to stay in the business, and we subsequently had to build a new building. International Harvester required it, so we went south of town, and then within 1977, the rest of the bank that the family didn't own came up. Home State Bank came up for sale. So I was able to put a deal together. I was 25 years old, deeply in debt to build a new implement shop, buy the bank, and that was then kind of what my path was for the next 30 years to get those businesses paid for, established, grown. So was pretty intense, yet during that time also very active in the community, in our church, and Lori was as well. We had 2 children. Son Paul was born in 1979, daughter Stephanie born in 1982. So had relative good fortune, and the businesses got paid for and moved ahead, and we built a couple bank buildings and added on to the dealership, and that kind of landed to 2005 when after 30 years in the business, my son Paul was now back in the business after graduating from the university and working in banking for 3 years, but his heart was with the dealership, the agricultural equipment business. So he came back to start in the business, and we made the decision to run for the Nebraska legislature. The decision kind of came, I was mayor of Louisville, had been on the city council, school board, and plus volunteer things, but I can remember very clearly in September of 2005, it was an open seat. Roger Werbine had served for 20 years, but because of term limits, he could not run again. And one evening, he and his wife Janine showed up at our house in Louisville, and my wife Lori was very hesitant about running, both the process, the $12,000 a year salary, the time it takes, the commitment it would take, and so I remember she was working in the yard. She really didn't want to hear about it. The Werbines were really pressing, thinking that something we should do. We've been active in many community things and Republican Party activities over the years, so we knew them well. So I had Lori come in. She listened to the spiel, and she said, "Well, if we're going to do it, we're going to win." And I'm, that's the only way I'm going to think about it. And subsequently, she was as good a candidate's wife as you could ever ask for. We we knocked on thousands of doors. We did all of it pretty much ourselves, 99.9% of it, which was every night, every weekend for a year of Nebraska City, Plattsmouth, Weeping Water, all the small communities. We knew a lot of the farm folks, of course, but you think you know a lot of people, but in that district there's 37,000 people and usually 13, 14, 15,000 votes. So you don't know everybody, and it was a big effort, particularly in Nebraska City where our family name wasn't as well known. So a real interesting experience, very intense, and we were successful in the 2006 election. So I enjoyed the experience, a lot of work, a lot of intense times, but I always, when I walked in that Capitol building on the east side every morning after I parked in the Senator's parking lot, I looked up and all the counties of Nebraska are around the Capitol, and I'd always glance up and look at Cass County, the name, and think how humbled I was to serve, and it's a beautiful building, and knowing all the fine folks I represented, it was a privilege and a real interesting experience. There's a little tidbit of history that one of the people, and probably one of the most prominent people that will have ever served in the Nebraska legislature would of course be Ernie Chambers. from Omaha, and he'd been there for 36 years, served for 2 years with him, and then he was termed out, and he since has been reelected. But Senator Chambers is well known as being really pretty tough on people, and to gain his some measure of respect, there's never any really particular friendship, but to have him at least not totally against you is kind of an important thing to try to establish. And I was able to, the story I think is kind of unique and says something about history, Pat. He gave a talk one day on the floor of the legislature, and he talked about how racial minorities had fought in the conflicts of the United States of America, and he went all the way back to the Revolution. He took every conflict, every war, and talked about different folks, particularly African Americans, and their contributions. So when he was done, he sat 2 rows directly in front of me. I went down. I said, "Senator Chambers, that was a fine speech. I like history, and I think you really hit on a lot of things." But I said, "On that War of 1812, I think you made one mistake." And he said, "Well, what is that?" And I said, "Well, the Battle of New Orleans that you referenced, and the Creole black soldier that killed the British general, which since caused Andrew Jackson to be famous, and maybe one of the reasons he became president of the United States." I said, battle was important and those things were true, but the battle was fought after the war was over. The treaty had been signed in London, the ship was on the way back, the battle was fought 2 weeks after the war had been declared over. They just didn't know it. The news didn't get to New Orleans back in those days. So he took that all in. I went back to my seat. About 10 minutes later he came back and he said, "Where are you from?" I said, "Louisville, Nebraska." "Where'd you go to school?" I said, "Louisville." "Did you go to college?" "Yes." "Where?" "University of Nebraska." What did you study?" "Business administration." "How did you know that?" "I like history." And he said, "Well, I've given that speech for 36 years and no one's ever caught me on it." And after that, we had a certain measure of mutual respect, and I was very privileged on his last speech that he gave after the 36 years. He named one senator, and his comment was, "When you folks have a history question, ask Senator Pankonin, he'll know it." So that's a little twist with the history of having that interest in it, and how that helped me with him to get some bills, at least across the bow there. And we exchanged some books, and it ended up being kind of an interesting relationship. So I was down at the legislature, and then we had at that time a gentleman by the name of John Plunkett as president of Home State Bank. And in April I was running for re-election, so it would have been in 2010. It was April, and it was short session because had registered for re-election, and the primary was in May. And in early April of that year, John Plunkett died very suddenly. Similar circumstance to my dad. Went home and passed away at age 54. My dad had been 56. So again, another big change that caused a lot of disruption and change in my life and our lives. So I went down to the bank. The legislature was adjourning, and we looked at all the different situations, but the group was getting older. It would have been hard to hire someone because we probably didn't have that many more years left. So subsequently I took on that role as president of the bank, and tried to serve in the legislature for 1 more year because I did get reelected. I could not get off the ballot at that time, so I was somewhat obligated to give it a try, and I did. But between the dealership and the bank and the legislature, it was I was going to be the next one that was going to expire. It just was 80-hour weeks and a lot of pressure. So I made the decision in October of 2011, and Lori and I went to the governor's office and met with Governor Heinemann to say that, just was going to have to resign. And so that kind of ended that chapter. I'm glad I had it, but it was unfortunate. I always felt bad that the citizens, who had reelected me, did not get my full measure of service. But things had just changed in my life, and there was other people involved in the bank that were counting on that investment to come through. So after 5 years at the bank, we made the decision. There was nobody in the next generation interested in that business, so we made the decision to sell in 2014, and successfully did that in January 2nd of 2015, sold Home State Bank Pinnacle Bank, that industry had changed, and as we've seen in other banks in Cass County, that industry with the passage of the Dodd-Frank legislation really put a regulatory burden on small institutions that'll be really tough. It's happened to some other banks in Cass County, it'll happen to others. It just is a different business model now. So son Paul has taken charge as the manager of the dealership, and after the bank sold, I've returned to work with him, but have more flexibility and a lot less stress. And Lori and I have recently remodeled a house at a place called Copper Dollar. So now actually we have a Plasmith address for our retirement years, and enjoying that. So it's been an interesting arc of experiences. Been very blessed. Our daughter Stephanie lives in Hastings. We have 5 grandchildren, and that's kind of the story in a nutshell.
Wow. Okay, if we want to just go back, when do you first remember working in your grandparents' store?
That's a good question, Pat, because the times, being born in 1951 in the 50s, it was very typical. My wife Lori grew up in the town of Laurel, Nebraska, similar sized in northeast Nebraska, north of Wayne in the Sioux City area. And her dad was a small town veterinarian, and our experiences were very similar. It's probably because, it's probably one of the reasons why our marriage has been successful, lasted 41 years, a lot in common in our backgrounds and interests. But back then I can remember going down to the dealership. It'd be open on Saturday nights. Saturday nights the farmers would come to town, and all the businesses would be open, and it was part business, part social. The farmers may bring eggs to town, or it's a little bit, it precedes the days of the so-called farmer markets, but I can remember that there was a lot of buzz of activity that sort of all ended soon after, but I can remember that a little bit. Of course, can remember working at the dealership from the high school years on, either after school and summers, of course. And so, had the experiences of helping in the shop and in the parts area. And one of the big things I really enjoyed was going to the country. We call it going to the country with my dad, riding in a pickup truck to call on customers. And we had a fair amount of business over across the river in Iowa, and those trips usually meant stopping in Glenwood, Iowa, or Council Bluffs, or somewhere for a hamburger. And I do remember, for some reason, those experiences, talking to my dad more about his college days and his World War II service, and so it was a time to bond and learn a lot of the family history and some of his history, and just always enjoyed the countryside and the time to be with him. So, I wasn't a total stranger to the business, but to have that come on at age 23 was obviously a fairly big undertaking, and then to have the bank happen 2 years later was very unusual for a 25-year-old. I think, first of all, some big opportunities, but also everybody in my family knew I had early maturity, but I think through hard work, strong religious faith, great marriage partner, it wasn't easy. And then the mid-80s came, and there was some big-time troubles in the ag sector. So it was some close calls at an early stage. But on the other hand, when you're young, I thought many times since that I would never have taken on that much debt or those responsibilities. You were almost naive enough to think you could make it work, and it did. So, kind of an interesting story.
How about changes with when did you say you built the implement dealership south?
The building was built, and we moved in February of '77. And another little sidebar on that, the Coop family that controlled the bank at that time, I was interested in that. I'd studied finance at Northwestern University, and I'd gone and talked to Harvey and Ellen Coop, who were up in their 70s, 80s at the time, about the bank. But they said, well, they weren't ready to sell. Then one of them passed away, and I'd already gone down the path of building the new dealership building. So we bought the bank in September of '77, And I don't know what if we could have bought the bank before we did the dealership deal, it could have been a changed circumstance, but it kind of all worked out in the long run. But it just put that much more, oomph into what we had to try to get accomplished and the debt to get paid. But my mom was so supportive. She was such a big believer in me that, and she was the one that really staked her financial future as well on me. And it came out. I got her paid in a much quicker fashion than the note said, but she was a believer in me, and I always really appreciated that. There's another story that I'm thinking now, Pat, that I think is interesting and maybe tells a little bit about myself as well. In 1969, it was the foreign travel for students. It's got to be a pretty common thing, particularly maybe college experiences, but it wasn't as common back then. But there was one group that my mom found out about where you could go to Europe for, in those days it was expensive, but for now it doesn't sound that expensive. But we looked into it, and she knew some people where their children had gone. And so there was a trip that left out of Des Moines. Everybody was from the same high school out of Des Moines, but for like $1,300 you could go for 6 weeks to Europe. My dad took a little more dim view of the whole operation from the standpoint I wouldn't be home to work for one thing. And so the deal was this, and it was so typical of him. He said, I'll tell you what, David, the $1,300 plus you have a couple $100 for spending money, I'll buy you a car for that money, which wouldn't have been a new car, but it would have been a pretty nice car in '69. Or you can take this trip, but if you take the trip, you will not drive your senior year except to work for me. So I made a decision to take the trip, and he followed through on his word. I never drove. I always had to ride with friends or walk my senior year in college. And but I am so pleased that I took the trip for several reasons. Obviously, the experience of traveling Europe, and it was a low budget type deal. We stayed in hostels, and the accommodations were usually bathroom down the hall and those sort of things. And it was younger, obviously high school age kids. But I think the other thing that was tough about that, or a good experience, is that you were in a high school group and you didn't know anybody. It was a plane load of people that were in the same high school. And so you had to make your way with friendships, and as you travel around the different cities, you live with different people, or different young people. And I just think that experience was an important one. And then I think subsequently, when I went to Northwestern University, I had graduated with distinction from the University of Nebraska. But to go to a Big Ten school in a high-powered MBA program, and it was one of those deals where about the first week, they had you all in one room. They said, everybody's done really well in their undergrad, and a lot of them had been out in the business world. But he said, we're going to flunk 25% of you out. You won't make it. It's going to be hard to hack. And so that was kind of like, that was and it was. You could study 24/7, and every quarter my grades got better, but it was a push. And I always thought subsequently that was another experience that helped prepare me for when my dad died, because I'd been pushed to the limit, and also just out there on my own. I was engaged to my wife Lori, but really had to kind of fight through that, and it was just those things I think have built for me experiences that gave me the confidence and the wherewithal to take on some of the challenges that came.
When you were in the MBA program, did you intend to return to Louisville when you graduated?
No, there was probably little chance of that. My dad actually probably discouraged it. I had some really nice job offers out of Lincoln, but I had some really fine offers there. One of the things that had helped me there that was another experience, in the summer of 1973, I worked in Washington, D.C. for the United States Senate. I was an intern in the office of Roman Huruska, the U.S. Senator from Nebraska at that time, or one of them, of course. And the reason I got the job was the congressman at the time was Charlie Thone, who then subsequently became a governor of Nebraska. But when Congressman Thone in the Lincoln area, I had volunteered to help him on his campaign in undergrad, and he liked me, and I really felt like he was a mentor. And he said, "But you could come and work for me, but it really would be a nicer experience, a more important experience to work for the United States Senate. So the summer of '73, I worked in Washington, D.C. That was Watergate summer, and so it was a lot of upheaval in the federal government. I went to a lot of those hearings, and that also somewhat sated an interest in politics. I'd always been interested in it, but at that level, it was, and lived again, was with a couple guys on 606 East Capitol Street in Washington, D.C., so we walked to the Capitol every morning and lived in an area that wasn't as nice as it is now by any means, but it was just there again, another one of those experiences, get in a car, drive to Washington, D.C., and on your own, make your way. So I just think a lot of those experiences made a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Are you going to write a book?
I think that's what we're doing now.
Yeah, well, but I think there's so many encouraging family histories, and I've even done it on the computer. I started with the first thing I remembered, but yes, your book will be on film,
Well,
because it's telling.
this is a nice experience, and I do think these experiences are interesting, and I mean, I don't want to jump to questions necessarily, but if you talk about the dealership building in 1977 and I literally just thought about this again this week. We kind of built it, for the time it was probably built fairly large for the size of the equipment. And I can even remember and thinking, did we go overboard? And some of the old farmers subsequently came in years later and said, we thought you'd go broke. You built this big building and we just didn't think you were ever going to make it, and on. But the thing was, I'm glad we did. We added on a couple times, but the equipment has just changed radically. Has changed radically over that 40-year time period. So the sophistication that's built in, obviously the computers and electronics and just everything, the size, and actually the building is still held. So it's been more than adequate actually, and it was a good basic design, and I'm glad we had it at the time, because when you look back now, it was a bargain to build compared to what it would be to build that facility today. So I'm glad we did. But the equipment just, the owner's manuals back then, and the equipment was basic. Owner's manuals maybe half-inch, quarter-inch, half-inch thick. Now the service manual on a new tractor is on the computer, because we just looked one up the other day, 4,700 pages of the service manual. So just the complexity, the changes, the capacity, the horsepower, there's been a sea change in the equipment, and a corresponding large reduction in customers. When I find some of those old records from the late 70s, my son Paul's amazed. We had 400 or 500 accounts. That's now 200, 250. It's probably a third of what it was on the number of farmers. And this area is probably not as aggressive as some in the consolidation, but it's been a big change. Another little interesting tidbit is this last summer, Lori and I went to Madison, Wisconsin. The University of Wisconsin has the archives of the International Harvester Company. The McCormick family and that business eventually dissolved in the mid-'80s, and there's been some subsequent owners, and it's Case International, Case IH, owned by C&H Industrial Company, literally out of Europe now. But back then, we walked in, and a guy named Lee Grady, who was the curator for the collection, and the McCormick family owned a lot of ground around Chicago, and so they had the money to support this thing, and it's a treasure trove of records and publications and manuals and pictures, and we spent half a day there, and it was just wonderful. But I asked him right away, I said, C.J. Pankonin, my grandfather, go back, reference to records, and in 1947 there had been some kind of lawsuit or legal action, and International Harvester had to release the name of all their dealers. In the United States, there was 10,000 dealer locations, and they were almost all individual stores. Now that's down to less than 800 locations. So, and when I came into business in 1975, it was 5,000. So it went from 10,047 to 5,000 to less than 800. And so that was just to last and be relevant in that business has been another kind of unusual thing.
So has the implement business, have you always serviced as well as sold?
Sure, and and I think part of it was good reputation for the parts and service because, you know, besides initial investment, people want to keep that investment going, and the parts and service business is, you know, out of the whole mix is a big part of the business and a big part of your gross income. The margins are better there, and that's a big part of covering your overhead. Not all of it, but it covers a lot of it. And so it's been important. I think we've had a, you know, decent reputation and good part stock and long hours when the harvest and the spring and the planting. We are open 7 days a week, and so and that's another thing. I think I'm enjoying this stage of life because for 40 years it was. I think my average work week would have been 70 hours a week between the business, the public service, the bank, whatever. It was just 70 hours a week, week after week after week for 40 years. That's a long go.
Who's your biggest competitor?
Well, on a macro situation, John Deere company is the #1 in the world and pretty much in most areas. I think it's pretty much a kind of a 50-50 thing here between the red equipment and the green equipment, but John Deere is a big competitor everywhere. As far as dealers though, as the dealer locations, we are the only location now in Cass County. The John Deere location in Plattsmouth moved over into Iowa here several years ago. So when I started, there would have been 6 freestanding dealership locations in Cass County. So now there's 0, or we're the only one left. Everybody else gave up or moved or most closed, of course. So.
Where is the closest Case dealership?
The Case IH dealership, the closest would be south of Syracuse and east, you know, quite a ways into Iowa. North would be Fremont, Wahoo, and west Seward. So, and that would be, a lot of the John Deere dealerships are in kind of those similar locations. So we've got a nice radius of 25, 30 miles.
Through the years, has Case taken over any other?
Sure, I mean, the Case IH was a consolidation between Case and International Harvester, but there's been other companies that have come in the fold. Steiger, which made 4-wheel drive tractors, was a purchase, and there's been others. There's been consolidation at the manufacturer level and dealer and farmer level. Kind of all flows the same.
Dale, anything you
Well,
comes to
I
mind?
just wanted to ask you, you know, you referenced the dealerships being downsized in numbers and covering bigger areas, and I just, how do you feel it relates to the counties, the small towns and everything where farmland has basically done the same thing and your customer base is decreased and buying larger equipment to farm more land and
And you bring up an interesting dilemma or quandary or whatever. Obviously, the equipment gets more sophisticated and can do more, and so it eventually eliminates a lot of smaller operations. Although in this county, and in our other main county is Sarpy County, and Sarpy Cass is the bulk of our business, probably 80%. We have a more smaller, mid-sized farmers here than a lot of areas, which is we really are very, very pleased with. It gives diversity of the operation, also a better chance to sell the used equipment. But I think one of the reasons for that is Cass and Sarpy County are relatively a wealthy farming area. A lot of solid, particularly German immigrants that were here and basically conservative and good operators and built their operations up. And so some of them, you know, they're still farming, even though they're not in growth mode anymore, but they've been able to go. And the other thing that's helped is we've had a lot of opportunities for off-farm income, whether it was a spouse, you know, working, or the farmer themselves working and then farming part-time. We've had more of that here. We have some very large operations as well, but I think we've had a little more diversity here than Central Illinois or some of those places. And I really enjoy the fact that the dealership, it's multi-generational, and we have so many customers that are multi-generational. And it is, my son Paul would not have known my dad, who was mainly, people called him Elwood, around here was Charles Elwood, but Elwood or Pank or whatever, but he feels like he knows him because so many of our customers remember him and tell Paul stories about him. So it's just, that's unusual, and it's still unusual for me to be able to work with my son, like a lot of our customers, father and sons working together. To me, it's, when that works, it's a privilege and a great experience, and we don't have that in America near like we did. It has to be small business or agriculture, you know, it just, those things don't happen as much. And Paul really has a feel for the history of the business, and it's not easy, and you know, you kind of wonder. My dad didn't think it would go another generation, and it did. He kept thinking that we're going to lose a lot of ground, and we have lost. When I go in Sarpy County, I can go to a lot of apartment houses where I used to call on farmers, and someone in Cass, but mainly in Sarpy County, there's been a lot of ground lost. But we've moved a little bit. There used to be a International Harvester dealer in Lincoln, and when they went out, then we, you know, to the west, we picked up customers. It seems like we always pick up a little more from the south, so we've kind of been able to, you know, hang in there. But I think it's problematical that Paul can maybe complete another generation. I'm not sure. You know, we're sure give it a try, but it's trickier between the size of the equipment, the size of the farms, the encroachment of the city. Just have to see.
Dave, what would you call a large operation when you first started compared to a large operation now?
The large operation when I would have started would have been 1,000 acres, and you know, there wasn't that many. And now that would be a middle-sized operation. And we have some very large, you know, a few very large ones around. The Aarons family, the Wiles brothers operation would be probably the two largest. And but there's many customers that are in that 2,000 to 3,000 acre range. Some in the 4,000, 5,000, 6,000, and then those others would be, you know, the Aarons family probably altogether is 18,000 acres, maybe something like that, in Casanova County.
Yeah.
How many employees do you have?
Currently, and it had stayed pretty level through the years. I think we have 17 employees right now, and I shouldn't say I think we do. I think we do have 17 on the payroll, and that number has probably stayed in that 16 to 18 range, fairly consistent.
And the majority in the service and repair
Yes, yeah,
fields and
parts and service areas.
parts and
Yes.
service, yeah. Okay,
Have you seen an increase in less diversification in the farms?
Oh, that's a good question, definitely. When I would have started, there still would have been a fair amount of livestock. Pretty much everybody would have had some livestock. And now these two counties are almost, there's hardly any. There's some cow-calf operations, the commercial hog operations. I don't know if I can think of one of them. There's just not any. There was probably 3, 4, 5, 6 dairies. They're all gone. So it's all gone pretty much to grain. There's some commercial hay operations where we have a good moisture situation here, so the commercial hay is good quality. But the livestock sector is pretty much gone by the wayside, and part of that is location close to where people live. It's not preferred anymore to have that, but also just economics and you know, quite frankly, the farmers, you know, enjoy the bigger equipment and covering the acres versus they'd rather be doing that than working with livestock, most of them.
And cow-calf operations are pretty well gone because every acre is turned into
Yeah, but there is
tillable acres.
But there is a fair amount of cow-calf. I mean, there's you know, actual numbers, but I can think of a lot of customers that have some cows. So, and they vary in size. They're not huge, but they're pretty much, there's a fair amount of those yet.
that next door to us, John Meisinger.
But there's quite a few.
Has a
There's quite a few cow-calf yet. So,
Can you give us some samples of the technology that's used in equipment now?
well, I think one of the things that is talked about on a national level of autonomous cars, cars that you ride in, but you don't necessarily have to drive, and that technology is, you know, it's being tested and is coming. But I think what people don't realize is that we've had that in tractors for several years. Now, we're not at the stage where there's not someone in the cab. But I think the amazing thing is, and when you see it, it's just almost eerie how it works. And in this area, we're grabbing off of satellite signals. But with a large planter that's 40 foot wide, and we think about how we used to, when the farmer would turn around and go back into the field, he would use a mechanical marker to try to follow that front of that tractor, either the wheel or the center. And of course, it was an honor to try to have straight rows and not overplant. So now these planters are, they might not even have markers on them, because they're getting a signal, and the farmer will turn the tractor, take us, get it set, boom, take his hand off the wheel, and it steers itself. And it's within, they call it sub 3 inches. If you really want to get precise, it's sub 1 inch, and you can do that when you pull signals off of a ground-based system. But off a satellite, with this technology, you can go back 40 feet and be planting just perfect rows. And then when you overlap in our hills, that's a 16-row planter. So, and if you've been in the field to hear it, it's just amazing. So now the technology is, so you don't overplant you've had the crop planted, and you're coming out on the side, and you're gonna overlap. So those rows now will sense and shut off, and you can hear them shut off, bing, 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 bing. So it will not plant over what you already planted, saving seed and then not having the plants compete against each other. I mean, that is space age technology, and the farmer doesn't even have his hands on the wheel. So they're there for something goes wrong and whatever. So agriculture's been further ahead of General Society in some of this technology. And the newer combines, to see what they can do, the capacities. I think about my dad going from horses to mechanical, but the change is even accelerated between the tractors of when he died in 1975 versus what, and we say that every once in a while. I mean, what would those folks think? And I had so many customers that I can particularly think of Art Hild, who did business with 4 generations. He did business with my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my dad, myself. And he would say, I grew up in a hut, and we had horses, and I saw a man land on the moon in his lifetime. So, we've seen changes, obviously tremendous, and what will that be in the future? It's hard, if anything changes, accelerating.